This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Each week, we do bring you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing, with discussions focused on trending topics, frequently asked questions, and industry best practices. This week, we are pleased to welcome Alton Johnson with us. He's here with us today. He's the principal of NGT Biopharma Consultants, and he has a long history of working in the pharmaceutical technology and business solutions arena. So we're going to have great discussions today. Welcome, Alton.
Thank you, Stacey. It's an honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to discuss an exciting topic today.
Yes, me too. Speaking of topics, we're going to talk about AI and Internet of Things and all kinds of technology-based items. Life science companies, as many folks know, today are looking for ways to constantly get ahead of their competition while staying patient-centric. Obviously, health and safety of the patients is top on everyone's list, but they also need to be compliant and profitable. And surprisingly, the thing standing in their way most often is their ability to embrace and leverage appropriate technologies or the Internet of Things, as we just mentioned. And speaking of that, the Internet of Things isn't really a new concept for any of our listeners, I imagine. And it's not even a new concept for pharma in terms of knowing that it's there. But one of the biggest stirs, I guess, in the industry and the life science companies continues to be not really understanding what the magnitude is in terms of bringing these technologies in, how it's going to affect their existing systems and processes, etc. So I'm hoping that you can really start us off with an understanding of the magnitude in developing an interconnected enterprise system.
That's a really good question and very perceptive of the status of IoT today. The magnitude of IoT is astounding, and it's absolutely growing every single day.
Sure.
The estimates of the number of devices and apps connected to the internet in 2020 ranges from 1 billion to over 50 billion. Now, when we look at the pharmaceutical industry and the pharmaceutical manufacturing, by contrast, it can be a real significant challenge to connect data sources. Unlike connecting your Nest unit or whatever you have at home,
right?
We have a large array of isolated systems in operation, and many of them just weren't designed for open two-way communications. And in most cases, an important consideration is that cybersecurity requirements aren't built into the IoT platform connections when it comes into pharmaceuticals. So the magnitude of pharma IoT connections is huge. I mean, just think about connecting equipment, instruments, laboratory information management systems, your building management, maintenance, supply chain, and quality management systems, a broad range of business processes like validation. It's a massive amount of work. So what an IoT platform will do is facilitate these comprehensive connections that we need to make. But it does require a massive investment. Even if it's staged out over time, cumulative, it amounts to a lot. So understanding the value that's going to be derived and when is a really important consideration as well. So understanding that scope and then what you're going to get out of it for making that investment is critically important to going on that IoT journey.
And that all makes sense. I mean, there's so many moving parts that it would seem that, a platform that can integrate all of those would be absolutely essential to making sure everything stays on track, working the way you expect. The cost definitely is probably the biggest factor, wouldn't you say, in terms of the slow start that we're getting as an industry in integrating IoT?
So it is an important factor, but I would say that there are three buckets of barriers to entry. One, of course, is the infrastructure and the cost that's associated with upgrading that, but also the regulatory barriers and the culture and mindset. So let's tackle infrastructure first and the cost.
Sure.
The pharmaceutical manufacturing capital assets are not inherently designed for connectivity, as we just mentioned. Things are typically isolated and standalone. So we also find that most of our processes are manual and paper-based historically. A lot of the key knowledge is tacit, and it resides within individuals' heads and isn't readily accessible when we need it in the right form. So data from these isolated, standalone operations often aren't easy to access or connect outside that immediate process operation. So that's one barrier. Another contributing factor to infrastructure is our original equipment manufacturers typically have their own unique and proprietary automation standards and controls, and modifying those systems for two-way communication can actually invalidate either service agreements or worse, the warranties on the equipment. So there can be an investment required to upgrade, and bringing down a manufacturing operation to do those upgrades has to be carefully considered.
Sure.
So if we go to culture and mindset, it's not that pharmaceuticals are as retrogressive as we sometimes claim. People do want to change and move forward, but we just don't really have a roadmap. We don't really have, it's a different way of thinking and operating. So what we're doing is dividing the work differently among technology or machines and humans. And this dramatic shift toward more data-driven, less intuitive approaches can make people feel disenfranchised if they don't understand how it's going to work and how their skills are going to be used and the value that they're going to add. Furthermore, I think recognition and rewards are set up for heroes, people who come in and solve problems, right?
It does seem that way, yes.
So it's important to help people transitioning to IoT and intelligent solutions to give them the right information at the right time, in the right context, to the right people, to enable them to achieve that performance excellence that they want. And once they understand that, people do typically embrace it. But there does need to be some work to help people understand that and make that transition.
Sure. I mean, obviously, the return on investment, people are going to be looking at that, right? So do the ends justify the means? And are they going to push us further ahead in the industry to where we need to be to do our best work for the patients and for the industry? So stepping back for just a moment, because I know that the Internet of Things, and whether it's machine learning, automation, different things that can be introduced into the pharmaceutical and medical device industries, bring with them some great gains, including increased knowledge of the entire life cycle, real-time analytics, continuous production capabilities. I mean, the list goes on. So you talked about the barriers to entry, and some of these things obviously are important features that you do get once you are integrating these in. But can you talk about really the importance of these items and what it actually brings to the organization to have these greater insights?
So really what it does, and I summarized it briefly as the right information at the right time in the right context to the right people, so that we're not seeking out we spend more time finding the data than we do actually using it.
Right.
So really this platform will provide what we need to do our work and really use our brain power, not for chasing down tedious tasks, but for really making decisions and continuously improving our operations. We'll have the information and the time to do that. So I think that's the biggest advantage, is that it really enables us to have the information we need to do excellent work.
And we have it a lot faster, right? Because I mean, it's almost instantaneous. If something's going wrong, you can see that start to happen much more quickly than you can with a manual process.
Yeah, today it takes 2 weeks to find the data, and you're reacting.
Right.
With this kind of system, you know what's going to happen before it happens, and you can take proactive and preventive actions to head it off. And that puts you in a much stronger operational position, regardless of what part of the supply chain that you're in.
Yeah, highly, highly valuable. So the entire life cycle during drug or device development can benefit from advanced technologies, as we've just been discussing. From process design and manufacture to analysis and distribution. So really every phase of production can see benefit from these technologies. Where do you see the greatest impact to a company, just starting, dipping their toes in, so to speak, but just starting to edge towards integration of technologies? And how does this compare to companies that are maybe further along down that road?
So my recommendation would be start with your end-to-end supply chain assessment, because that is similar across industries. And if you go within the pharmaceutical industry, that it's quite similar, even more so. So you can learn a lot by looking at methods of demand forecast, data, and intelligence on the status and location of your product, your lead times, your safety stock, your distribution, to name some.
Sure.
And the benchmarks for these systems are available. So you can start and see what will actually impact your ability to supply quality at the right cost with the right customer service. So I would say if you have those supply chain analytics, you can start there. If you don't, and you just want to dip your toes in, most of us know where our big pain points are.
Right.
Is it process variability? Is it product release times? Is it foreign matter in your product? Is it excursion reporting, investigations, and validation processes? Where are the hangups?
Yeah.
And assessing those, we can often jump in and start there. What kind of data would we need? What kind of intelligence would we need? What could IoT provide? And start with that.
I think that's great that you mentioned supply chain. And it's very timely, of course, because right now, as we're in the midst of, I'm hoping we're soon coming towards the end of COVID-19, right? I know, but we are in the midst of it. And one of the things that has become glaringly obvious during this pandemic is the huge holes in our supply chain processes, or the whole supply chain globally, so to speak. And in the midst of this, I think there's definitely lessons to learn, but what do you feel that, I guess, that lessons learned from this whole experience in terms of not only what's happened and what we've seen break with the supply chain, but how can technologies, the integration of technologies really going forward make an impact on that? So if you can elaborate, I know you touched a little bit on it, but if you can elaborate more, I think it's so important to what we're seeing right now.
I think we can see, particularly with COVID-19, the incredible importance of information and data sharing, the analytics, and knowing what the data are underneath that, right, and how the conclusions were made. So the other area, we've seen an incredibly rapid redeployment of effort in the biopharmaceutical industry to address the needs, whether it's new treatments, identifying what potential treatments are out there, vaccines, and other clinical approaches in the hospitals, and sharing that information of how to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 once it hits. And more importantly, going forward, how to prevent and mitigate it proactively. And at the core of this massive collaboration across industry, government, academic, and healthcare professionals is connecting that information. And if we had an IoT solution in place, imagine how much more quickly we could have gotten ahead of this,
of course,
and then mitigated some of these things more quickly. And even when we're in the crisis, things like PPE shortage, the personal protective equipment for, right, our frontline healthcare workers and our essential workers, is absolutely critical. And if we had better data in real time, we could manage this crisis much more effectively, even when we hadn't planned adequately in some cases for what was going to happen. The other thing I'd like to mention, the MHRA, and you'll have a reference to this, just issued a guidance for remote approvals. With so many of us working remotely,
Absolutely.
they wanted it very clear on how you could collaborate. You could have a second witness who's remote from the actual operation. To do those signatures, for example, review and approval of a document, or actually constructing the documents, can be done by people in separate locations. So again, IoT can help provide the communication and the data necessary to do that, so that we can tap into that information wherever we are. We don't necessarily have to be on site where the activity is actually occurring. So another big enabler of in the COVID era and the post-COVID era is this remote working and remote collaboration.
Absolutely. And even the remote audits, we've seen several temporary regulations and some long-term ones as well come out to talk about, okay, we are here. We still need to make sure that things are happening the way they're supposed to happen, that organizations are being compliant. And we know we can't send people out there, so we're going to do this remotely. And we've had discussions. We actually did a podcast a few weeks ago with a group who was doing the virtual audits. And so, we have good understanding of how those are working. And I think that all of those things are definitely in support of the Internet of Things and how important it is to have this readily available to us as an industry, but also as individuals. I think just the way that people were able to quickly go to their homes and continue working in their whatever industry they were in was obviously a testament to the technologies that we all do have and use regularly. So thank you for that. I think that I wouldn't want to, even though the supply chain had showed serious issues during this pandemic, I think that people's response to it has been amazing. The FDA has moved quickly to make new guidelines, and other regulators too. I mean, I'm just thinking of them, but to make new and temporary guidelines to keep the industry moving. Manufacturers outside of the pharmaceutical and device industries have come together to create, from hand sanitizer to PPE products and more to keep us going. So everybody's doing their part. And I want to just say that here, because we're always talking about how the supply chain is not working. But I mean, really, there are lots of great things that have happened as well in that. So I just wanted to say that. But so stepping back, though, to our discussion on integration of technologies into pharma, medical device, et cetera. You mentioned supply chain being one of the areas that they really can start to look at. But wherever a company is today in their journey towards implementation of IoT, whether it's at the very beginning, somewhere in the middle, or much further down the path, they have to start or continue with a digital transformation vision. So a kind of a vision for where they want to be, a strategy, and if they're at the beginning, an implementation plan. And as you mentioned at the beginning, there's not a clear roadmap for making this happen in your organization. So how does one begin this process? And what are some of the common issues or concerns in planning that you've encountered in your experience?
That's a really good point, Stacey. I think it's really important to have that vision of where a company wants to go with IoT. What are the benefits, and what's their strategy? And the first place to start, I think, is the IT infrastructure. One of the first and primary concerns that have to be addressed is cybersecurity.
Yes.
All of a sudden, we've had all these isolated systems that are hard connected, and we're opening them up to a networked design. And some of the instruments and the equipment and so forth were not built for cybersecurity, and certainly the connections we make between them, we have to make sure that that design to protect from malfeasance is built in from the very beginning. And then as part of that design stage, in addition to cybersecurity, we need an overall architecture of the system defined so that we then know roughly how we're going to proceed at a future date. Now, information technology evolves at a rapid pace. Mm-hmm. So I would emphasize we don't need the perfect and final vision and strategy and implementation plan, but we need some flexibility. But without some overall architecture to drive how we're going to design this, we could end up with a dysfunctional system that won't act as a whole unit. So really, that design, that general design, with some flexibility built in, because we need to accommodate advances in technology as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, I think it's always going to be a work in progress, no matter how integrated they are, no matter where they are, because we are seeing upgrades to security. We're seeing upgrades to software packages, of course, on a continuous basis. And then, of course, any equipment that you're using in manufacturing or labs is going to need at some point, to be upgraded or to be maintained in some way. So, I mean, I certainly see that it's always going to be a work in progress. But hopefully the key word is progress, right? People are progressing towards that final vision. Do you have a sense of, I mean, I know you've done a lot of work in the area, a sense of some of the first steps or first, I guess, in building your vision, some of the first key things that you would want to look at?
So I think looking at faster decisions is a big one. Also looking at what kind of information we need and what slows it up. Where are our processes encumbered and what would unencumber those processes? Now, this space, we started talking about how massive it is.
Right.
And my advice would be just start. We can't be paralyzed by the fear and the unfamiliarity of this, or the fear of not achieving the perfect plan, because there is no perfect plan.
Of course.
And the best plan is going to evolve over time, as you so eloquently stated. So the fact is, it's not possible to design the perfect strategy or implementation plan because of the rapid evolution of technology. But what we can do is make sure that where we're focusing is going to deliver results. We can stay agile enough to modify as these technology advances come into play, but we can be assured that the business value is there for what we do if we set this up with the right focus.
Right. Very well said. Thank you, Alton. We are, of course, going to get into this is a 2-part episode. I failed to mention that at the beginning, but we are, of course, in the second half of this episode. We're really going to get into some of the practical applications of these concepts and hear more about some case studies, what's happened in real life, in real time, as well as the outcomes and benefits associated. But before we close this episode, I just wanted to pause here so you can give us any last minute advice, for our listeners who are still working toward embracing some of these concepts that we just discussed.
So there are a lot of examples out there, both outside the pharmaceutical industry and some emerging within the pharmaceutical industry. So we don't have, even though there's not a roadmap, we don't have to go it alone.
Right.
We can leverage what's out there. There are a number of coalitions out there that are focused in this area. So tap into that. There are a lot of benchmarks from some of the consulting firms in this space that could be subscribed to. And we don't have to learn everything the slow and hard way ourselves. We can build on what people have learned going before us. So besides just not being paralyzed by the fear and jumping forward, also use what's available and use the service and solution providers that are out there who have gone ahead, those benchmarks. And that will give us some courage to move forward, because the benefits are really compelling.
Excellent. That is great advice, Alton. I think we do often, it's human nature to become paralyzed by fear, or just that feeling of overwhelming, like, what do I do next, is so hard to overcome that it's much easier for many people to just sort of take the path of least resistance, right? But so I love that you're encouraging folks to just start somewhere and use your resources. Really, there's a lot of them out there. We will have some links in our show notes to some items that folks can check out. But I think that is great advice and a great way to pause until our next episode, where we'll really get into some of the case examples and real life applications of these technologies. So thank you again, Alton, for being with us for part 1 here. I also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And lastly, a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we would love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. And we'll be back again next week with the second half of this episode and our case study presentations with Alton. But until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.